Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. This is lecture numbered 7. In the aftermath of revisited science, thoroughly criticized positivism, as it was hinted toward the end of last lecture, we turn to some of those signposts in social science which would give us an idea of so-called post-positivist turn in modern social sciences. They would provide us with diverse methodological ways in which a different sense of science is being created. They would resurrect that category of experience in a qualitatively different manner, and there would be certain kind of refreshing insights emerging from this part of discussion. One wonders as to what could be the way of seeing, what kind of methodological apparatus would emerge in social science following the critique of positivism and revisited science. Phenomenology is one such instance. Reflecting upon the dispute in German sociology, it was noted by several scholars that there are many other ways of being post-positivist. Positivism in the aftermath of sullied science, in debate with Popper, would include sociology of knowledge and hermeneutics, phenomenology and ethnomethodology. These are some of the ways in which methodological discussion appear in order to deliver us some sense of post-positivism as to what happens after positivism. To begin with, in the field of phenomenology, one comes across several exciting possibilities of methodological significance. Despite the relation of philosophy of phenomenology with the German tradition, including the philosophy of Hegel, and most prominent body of phenomenological philosophy is Edmund Husserl's work. Many, including Max Scheler, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Alfred Schuss, have presented their respective readings of phenomenology. Each is revisited in social science, in particular in sociology, but Schuss' reading of Husserl's phenomenology is most often underlined as the best possible relation of phenomenology with sociology. This was Schuss who more or less successfully attempted to translate philosophy of phenomenology into a phenomenology which would be more conducive for discussions in sociology. The reasons of the importance of Schuss' synthesis of phenomenology and sociology are not sufficient. One does not come across well elucidated reasons, but one can guess that it is probably because he was the first to do it systematically and comprehensively. Schuss confronted this philosophy not with sociology as a whole, but with a sociological approach, and hence a fairly philosophical body of reasoning, that is phenomenology, becomes accessible within sociological framework. Alfred Shoes had benefited from direct interaction and correspondence of letters with Edmund Husserl, the philosopher, while Alfred Shoes aimed at revisiting Max Weber primarily. Moreover, he drew upon diverse other works, for example, of Henry Bergson, William James, Max Scheler, John Dewey, G. H. Mead, Charles Cooley, and W. I. Thomas. Many of them were symbolic interactionists, so to say. The first and foremost is a detailed acknowledgement of the limitations of social sciences in Shoes' version of phenomenology. It tries to understand intersubjectivity of thought and action and tries to show that the scientific positivistic framework does not allow us to get into the details of intersubjectivity. Evidently, there is a pool of meanings as it appears through phenomenological analysis. There is pool of meanings often taken for granted in method driven social sciences. This is despite the fact that Max Weber had tried highlighting the significance of meanings. If one can recall from one of the lectures given earlier, Max Weber therefore becomes more complex than any of his other counterparts in the frame of classical sociology who were working in the frame of positivism by and large. So, this ability of phenomenology to understand that the world at large is fraught with meanings and that has to be understood, this sets Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the philosopher, thinking critically of the rigorous social sciences which use mathematical language with such efficiency and yet fail to fathom an array of questions about the human experiences. Some of such questions are, in the words of Edmund Husserl, how does it happen that mutual understanding and communication are possible at all? How is it possible that man accomplishes meaningful acts purposively or habitually, that he is guided by ends to be attained and motivated by certain experiences? Do not the concepts of meaning, of motives, of ends, of acts refer to a certain structure of consciousness, a certain arrangement of all the experiences in inner time, a certain type of sedimentation? And does not interpretation of the other's meaning and of the meaning of his or her own acts and the results of these acts presuppose a self interpretation of the observer or partner? How can I, in my attitude as a man among other men or as a social scientist, find an approach to all this if not by recourse to a stock of pre-interpreted experiences built up by sedimentation within my own conscious life? These are some of the questions which become very crucial and starting point for phenomenological discussion for Alfred Shoes following Edmund Husserl. And allegedly many such questions are either taken for granted or explained away in social sciences. These questions solicit psychologically informed philosophical analysis, and that is crucial in phenomenology. Psychologically informed philosophical analysis rather than social science methods, techniques and measurement. This suggestion coming from phenomenology is of crucial significance for the students of social sciences in general and sociology in particular, who are usually taught that methods and techniques and various ways of measurement and correct words in research parlance such as objectivity, subjectivity, research ethics, etc., are sufficient to take care of our researches, our pursuit of knowledge. Phenomenology tries to set it right by saying that this is not sufficient. A psychologically informed philosophical analysis is more important than methods, techniques, and measurement. And this is the promise of phenomenology to deliver. It begins on the simple premise that I think and I feel are intricately related. That cognition, intellectual cognition, and emotional experience are intricately related, intrinsic to each other. This brings about an interface of experience and cogitation, of personal conscious life and phenomenological practices. To begin with, it entails reflection towards our own experience, following Husserl's theory of noesis, 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 that refers to the inward journey across experiences. Secondly, it requires us to unravel the intentionality of consciousness, quote unquote. The phrase is typically phenomenological phrase. It requires us to unravel, underquote, intentionality of consciousness, following Husserl's discussion on noema, Noema, that refers to the experienced, the object and process of cogitation. So, on one hand there is noesis, that is inward, on the other hand there is noema, which is outward. For consciousness is in itself as well as of or toward something. Consciousness is inward in itself as well as it is of something, towards something, outwardly. We are conscious independent of the world at large, but we are conscious of the world at large too. This curious duality with inherent cohesiveness of consciousness engenders experience into an equation whereby each specific noesis, inwardly experience, each specific noesis has its specific noematic correlate, our outwardly object. The inside experience and outside object are correlated. It's an exciting proposition indeed, that each of our experience in consciousness in itself is eventually related to noematic consciousness of something. In fact, Alfred Shoes deems the noematic to be the nucleus or kernel of intentionality in consciousness. Noematic, which is outwardly, is kernel, is nucleus of intentionality in consciousness in ultimate phenomenological analysis. This becomes more vivid as one takes note of the way Alfred Shoes weds Henry Bergson and Edmund Husserl in discussing experience. In discussing experience as streams of consciousness, he brings together two philosophers. With Bergson, there appears two broad domains: an inner experience, inner stream of experience, which is pure theory, and living within the world of space and time, that is experience of individual ego with full attention to life. Two domains. One is pure theory, pure experience, inner stream of experience, and the other is our existence in the real world, where we are living with our individual ego with full attention to life. A pure theory is characterized by a continuous coming to be and passing away of heterogeneous qualities. A lot of things happen inside in the inwardly experience. It is not possible to cognize the net of reflection in a pure theory. While experiencing inward, we do not necessarily cognize everything, every bit of experience. There are too many nows, now, here and now, appearing too frequently to be grasped sufficiently. When I immerse in pure Dewey, I take a dip in pure Dewey, in this pure experience inside, distinctions become alien, as Bergson taught us. There is no distinctions between various components of experiences within pure Dewey in the inwardly experience. The world of distinction, on the other hand, is that of noema, the objects outside, where things are finite and available for prolonged reflection. One can sit back and ponder upon them at ease. With Husserl, it is easier to draw a phenomenologically important conclusion about how to make sense of the dual aspect of consciousness. The knower has to step out of the duration, has to step out of many nows which are unfolding in that experience inside, and then reflect upon them. We cannot retrieve for reflection the non-discrete experience, the essentially actual, the indubitable being there, Dasein. Dasein was the category used by Heidegger. Husserl is trying to say that it's very difficult to retrieve the passing lived experience, the lived experience which is going on in the inner stream of experience. It's very difficult to retrieve it entirely. We cannot, however, aim at that part of it which becomes discrete experience. We cannot retrieve it entirely, but we can try to make an effort to look at that part of it which can be brought to our more controlled consciousness, where experience can be placed as discrete entity, where lived experience is something which has gone by and now it is available for your reflection, something which is accessible in memory, something which Husserl says has recapitulative reproduction, which can be remembered and reproduced. In this light, there are two key propositions that emerges from Alfred Schu's phenomenology, and I quote Schu's here. Quote begins, "The limits of recall coincide with the limits of rationalizability. The limits of recall coincide with the limits of rationalizability. Recoverability to memory is, in fact, the first prerequisite of all rational construction. That which is irrecoverable, and this is in principle always something ineffable, that which is irrecoverable, and this is in principle always something ineffable, can only be lived but never thought. It is in principle incapable of being verbalized." Quote ends. What is he trying to highlight? Something which has been already said, that there is limit to recover from our pure experience in that Dewey inner experience, in that noesis. A lot of things happen in noesis, in inwardly experience, but all those cannot be verbalized, and that is the limit of rationalizing the inner experience. With the basic principles laid out, it becomes possible to see the social world with a phenomenologically equipped way of seeing in social science. In this way of seeing, behavior is equivalent to seeing meaning endowed conduct. It is a behaved rather than behaving. It is a sedimented knowledge rather than experience passing by that enables further inquiry. In short, it enables us for wide awakenedness. It enables us for attention to life. This takes phenomenological way of seeing a little farther in making sense of the way the social world is organized. In phenomenology, this is called life world, an intersubjective, pragmatic, everyday world peopled with folks with natural attitude. While natural attitudes is about taking things for granted, it is also about operating and reasoning with a given stock of knowledge. Each individual has a unique possession of the stock of knowledge, the sedimented thoughts and wisdom determined by definition of situations and biographic orientation. It amounts to suggesting that I would inherit a stock of knowledge as per my location in socio-cultural and of course political arrangement, that I would operate with one part of folklore while someone else will operate with another part of folklore. The stock of knowledge offers me one set of stereotypes, values, prejudices and notions of progress, while it could be different for others in the same folk world. We all try to forge relations and impact one another in accordance with the stock of knowledge, which is also interchangeably called practical knowledge. We try to influence each other with this stock of knowledge that we operate with, and curiously enough, this is not a homogeneous and monolithic entity. The practical knowledge is not a homogeneous and monolithic entity as per phenomenological philosophy. Instead, it is incoherent, only partially clear and not at all free from contradictions. Stock of knowledge is in continual flux, changing from one now to another in the wake of new streams of experiences in consciousness. And that is why Shoes says, and I quote, "The emerging experience may, for example, be conceived as a pre-experienced same which recurs, or as a pre-experienced same but modified, or as a type similar to a pre-experienced one, and so on. Or the emergent experience is found to be strange if it cannot be referred to something which is pre-existing." The nature and scope of life world, thereof, natural attitude, stock of knowledge, or as you say practical knowledge, and perpetual process of experiencing bring about novel possibilities. It creates a domain of meanings to be seen through phenomenological way of seeing in social sciences. In continuation with the discussion on life world, Husserl reminded us of the diverse realms of experiences corresponding with provinces of meanings. Life world that is dominated by natural attitude is one such province. This is the province of meaning where ordinary folks have natural attitude and they have their own experiential narrative, within which we are pragmatic in our actions. We are actors taking many things for granted while reasoning with and acting upon with clear motives of two kinds. One kind of motive is because motive, because of something we try to do something else, and second kind of motive is in order to motive, in order to achieve something we try to do something. Because of, the motive because of alludes to the reasons, causal factors and large premise that drive actors, while the motive in order to is about another set of reason why an action is being performed. And in order to motive elucidates the objectives, the purposive rationality and the larger vision of why an actor is practically active. Instead of the separation of the two motives, which happens in Weberian sociology, which was interpretative in nature, and yet it was within the larger framework of positivism. There was a separation of the two motives, in order to motive and because of motive appeared separately. They are put together in practical activities of the actors in life world according to phenomenological social science. These two motives are together always in actors' actions. They figure even in the world of fantasy, where we are free from the pragmatic motives of the life world, and yet we have its specific because and specific in order to motive in place, as we imagine performances which we seldom perform. In our fantasies, we imagine performances which we may or may not perform, but in those imagined performances also, in those imagined actions also, these motives are put together. It is freed from the purposive fiat of the practical everyday life world and still located within the life world. Likewise, the province of scientific reasoning has its own location in the life world. It has its specific motives, purposes, relevance and activities. The province of scientific reasoning, as Husserl and so would Shoes conceptualize, they think that there is a divide between practical world of actors and theoretical world of scientists. The two actors and theorists, ordinary humans, folks and scientists, are masters of their respective worlds. Though theorists are located within the world of actors too, and that is where the complexity is. Scientists are also socially embedded actors. Reflecting upon that two province of meaning, and within each province of meaning locate the ordinary humans and the scientists. Looking at this complexity, Alfred Shoes, while trying to make a sociological reading of Husserl's philosophy of phenomenology, Shoes says, and I quote, "The leap into the province of theoretical thought involves the resolution of the individual to suspend his subjective point of view. And this fact alone shows that not the undivided self, but only a partial self, a taker of a role, a me under quote, namely the theoretician, acts within the province of scientific thought. This partial self lacks all essential actual experiences connected with his own body, its movements and its limits." Quote ends. This is a powerful acknowledgement of the partial self of a theorist or scientist, and it is and what connects phenomenology with the revisiting of science as well as proposition of a qualitatively distinct way of seeing in social sciences. Even though a phenomenologist likes to bracket in order to suspend the essentially taken for granted assumption, they bracket it. Even though they perform this bracketing, it is likely that it is only a partial comprehension of the pragmatic world that a theorist or scientist may comprehend. Even though Shoes proposes to have an interpretative sociology equipped with phenomenology, departing from the behaviorist assumptions or positivist assumptions, there is a possible lapse to subjectivism in Shoes' phenomenology. Unlike the methodological unity of the empirical sciences and purity of method, this way of seeing enables to adopt a subjective point of view, and toward this, the safeguarding of the subjective point of view is the only but sufficient guarantee that the world of social reality will not be replaced by a fictional, non-existing world constructed by the scientific observer. These are the words of Alfred Shoes, which emphasize that it's better to have a subjective point of view which can help us understand the real world and not a fictional world which has been diligently created by a scientific observer. Furthermore, the operation of mind's production and perpetuation of meanings and such details of subjective nature could be accessed with Husserl's phenomenology, and particularly a sociologically conducive reading and representation of it by Alfred Schuss. It is important to remember that Hegel's phenomenology of mind promised to comprehend consciousness too, but it is only with Husserl and following that with Schuss that the consciousness is analyzed through ordinary, common sense, mundane, everyday world. Here consciousness, Husserl's consciousness as well as Schuss' consciousness is not a philosophical abstraction as it appears in Hegel's phenomenology. Likewise, it is possible to suggest that the Cartesian question of cogito, which was all about the pure I thinking of like a thing, so Cartesian question of cogito is a question, important question for Husserl too, for Alfred Schuss too, but this question acquires a new lease of life of qualitatively different kind as the external objects, the finite part of cogitation, the noetic, come to play a crucial role in interface with noesis. Despite the noetic, the objects of external world important in the performance of transcendental bracketing, there have been criticism of phenomenology that it is not sufficiently historical and materialist. The neo-Marxist criticism from the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, particularly Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, is well known. Even though the phenomenological slogan such as back to things quote unquote sounds anti-idealistic, there is this slogan, phenomenological slogan back to things, which sounds like going against the German idealism which ruled high and heavy on many of the German social scientists. Despite that back to slogan thing being very crucial in phenomenology, there is a sense that it also goes to the height of idealism, since the things are mostly to do with consciousness. It carries forward the logical absolutism of some kind that we witness in orthodox scientism, as well as it also carries forward the concept of essence that we critically apprehend in the Greek Enlightenment and positivism. From Alfred Schuss, there emerges yet another important interest in making sense of the intersubjective world of meaning, which claims to distance from the philosophically abstract notion of consciousness. Exactly with the allegation that phenomenology is still abstract as far as it deals with the idea of consciousness, it is not sufficiently incorporating the devices from the real world. Precisely on this allegation, on this complaint, someone like Harold Garfinkel wanted to revisit phenomenology. The complaint of Garfinkel was precisely about the lack of the ordinariness in phenomenology as far as the representation of ordinary life is concerned, and hence the imperative, the necessity of yet another methodological approach, yet another way of seeing that can facilitate more documentation on the subjective world. As it has been noted by other scholars, the subject is predominantly, if the subject was predominantly cognitive in Husserl and also in Max Weber and Schuss, it is in ethnomethodology that we begin to see things selectively cognitive, things which promise to specialize in method. Ethnomethodology becomes a methodological a ground for methodological specialist. By trying to create this ethnomethodology, looking at the practices of ordinary folks, their mundane life, their everyday life, Garfinkel rearranges the fundamental principles of sociology by controverting but building upon Emile Durkheim. For objective reality of social facts is rethought. Garfinkel rethinks the objective reality of social facts as an ongoing accomplishment of the concerted activities of daily life, with the ordinary artful ways of that accomplishment being by members known, used and taken for granted, is for members doing sociology a fundamental phenomenon. What he brings to the center in the ethnomethodological discourse is the activities, the daily life, the ordinary, the artful ways employed by the ordinary folks, by members of society, who use them and also take them for granted, whose practices employ methods and they consciously take them for granted. Those things are very important for ethnomethodology. Clearly, it is about trying to create another way of looking at things within sociology by finding a link between the members of society and sociologists, by finding a relation between the members, ordinary members of society and extraordinary social scientists. It tries to forge a relationship, ethnomethodology tries to forge a relationship between the social way of doing things and the sociological way of understanding them. It makes a departure from the sociology's preoccupation with structured common sense world, which is also in a way the case with phenomenological understanding of the common sense world, as it appeared pretty much structured. Instead, ethnomethodology tends to ask, what is common sense world and how is it possible? The members of the common sense world, their activity, their everyday activities entail methods to make their activities visibly rational and reportable for all practical purposes. These are the words of Garfinkel. The ordinary folks try to do things and they also try to make their activities visibly rational, look rational, sound logical and also reportable, also accountable, which can be entered somewhere, which can be discussed, which can be made part of discourses in everyday life, which can explain the practical purposes behind every action. An ethnomethodological study is committed to study these activities, these methods and the accounts produced by the members. Accounts means reports of those activities produced by the members. And by doing so, ethnomethodology does not intend or is not supposed to deliver supplements to standard procedure. Their promise is not to give yet another variety of standard procedure. In other words, it is not a dramatic development of a new methodology that ethnomethodology seeks to deliver. It does not remedy to the practical actions, nor does it search for theoretically loaded humanistic arguments, keeping it to a bare minimum and thus methodologically maximum job of understanding and applying people's method. Garfinkel envisaged a distinguishable way of seeing in social sciences by the virtue of employing ethnomethodology. This all is once again with the promise to develop the inexact sciences further. Inexact sciences, in Garfinkel's phrase. For unlike exact sciences that dealt with objective expressions, inexact sciences grapple with indexical expressions. The indexical expressions available in human accounts are recognizable through some of the properties. One of the most important properties is the relation of the biography of the user of the indexical expression, the purpose of the user, the circumstances of utterance, and the conversation in which the indexical expression is reported to the auditor. Auditor here, auditor being the sociologist who is documenting. Such expressions are contingent upon time and space, as they can mean differently in accordance with the context, temporal or spatial context. Hence, there is a fathomable fluidity of meaning that can arise from indexical expression. It is relative to the speaker, as they are employed in relation with the speaker, object about which it is used, and other, the listener, auditor, reporter, etc. In Garfinkel's ethnomethodological way of seeing in social sciences, these indexical expressions are located in the accounts actors produce in the intersubjective world, that is same as in the case of phenomenology, as a world of practical activities, practical circumstances and practical sociological meaning. The way the members of social world produce and manage the settings of everyday life is similar to the way they make their everyday life accountable, accountable with account and able hyphenated, accountable, which means available for reporting, accountable. The hyphenated accountable is to suggest that it is about being able to produce account and not be accountable. Members do not only live in the political practical world, they practically engender accounts of their world, meanings, procedure and what not. Accountable in ethnomethodology is thus about observing and reporting, looking and telling. In this process of making life accountable, members observe rules, law-like prescriptions. However, they are loosely woven law-like prescriptions, because they are not fully spelt out, and hence they leave scope for intersubjective maneuverings. Thereby, members, actors, narrators lead their everyday life and in the same way produce accounts to make sense of what they do, what they think, believe and practice inter alia. Since everyday life is fraught with indexicality of meaning, fluidity of reason and contextual inconclusiveness, the accounts of everyday life exhibit the same tendencies too. Thus, accounts produced thereby are full of usages such as etc., unless, let it pass, which reflect the relation of account with the real situation, and thus a contextual rationalism arises. Unlike the sciences in which rationalism is determined by scientific authority from somewhere above or somewhere else with a word of objectivity, ethnomethodology invites us to see rationality arising from the practical life and thereof accounting. This is a practical variety of rationalism, since the usages in an account, as in real life, are determined by their utility. To make a witty proposition, if an expression is not useful, we do not employ it. If a wink in answer to another wink is of no utility, we do not wink. The rational feature of accounts and thereof expressions depends on what members make of their accounts. Thus, ethnomethodology is the investigation of rational properties of indexical expressions and other practical actions as contingent ongoing accomplishment of organized artful practices of everyday life. While members in everyday life conduct their common sense practical activities with due amount of reflexivity in making things accountable, the ethnomethodologist adopts a resembling method. Following Karl Mannheim, it is documentary method that seeks to unearth patterns and homologies in the vast pool of meanings. In this method, each actual appearance is the document of, pointing to, standing on behalf of a presupposed underlying pattern. Thus, each is in connection with other such appearances. The preordained information and unfolding appearance come in direct relation in the documentary method. In a document of actual appearance, to reiterate, each is used to elaborate the other. In this way, ethnomethodology seeks to bring together the familiar scenes, the world known in common, and the relatively less familiar, taken for granted features of everyday life. The foreground, the on stage, and the background, the off stage, are brought face to face to divulge meanings in an ethnomethodological pursuit of knowledge. This may be fraught with shock when one seeks to disturb the familiar scene in order to comprehend the structures of everyday activities. Bewilderment, consternation, and confusion could be conducive, according to Garfinkel, to generate socially structured affects of anxiety, shame, guilt, and indignation. And in final analysis, such actions of ethnomethodologists and reactions of the members of society aid in divulging the structured patterns and effects. In the details of the method, ethnomethodology propagates a notion that has been often reviled, criticized along the lines of ethics and feasibility. Is the notion of ethnomethodological indifference, quote unquote. Ethnomethodological indifference is at the core of the experimental tendencies in the method. This is an indifference to any moral consideration that might interfere an ethnomethodologist's activities to understand the meaning. When a familiar scene explodes with bewilderment and anger, to facilitate an ethnomethodologist with the documentary evidence of how everyday life is organized, there is an instance of ethnomethodological indifference there. With this tendency, ethnomethodology tries to distinguish itself from the sociological debates on value neutrality. Value neutrality is woven around the distinction of is and ought to be, whereas ethnomethodological indifference is an indifference to this distinction about what is and what ought to be, what is good and bad for society. However, the implications of this indifference are also dubbed as methodological sadism in the name of objectivity of some kind. With the two prominent stream of methodological reasoning, namely phenomenology and ethnomethodology, we have understood as to how a post-positivist turn in social science takes us very confidently to the domain of subjective experiences. What these two try to create for us is a possibility of doing yet another kind of science, a science which is not averse to subjective experiences, a science which is interested in making sense of subjective experiences. This is where we would end lecture number 7. In the next lecture, we will try to move ahead and see as to how, in the light of phenomenology and ethnomethodology, one can look at some of the other instances which are also equally significant in the so-called post-positivist social sciences. Thank you. Delete thank you from the previous part, from the end part of lecture 7, and add this as conclusion. Both phenomenology and ethnomethodology seem to be ideal response to the situation which has arrived in the wake of revisited science and revisited positivism. These two seem to be radical at one level, in the sense that they are making it central, making subjective experiences central to the methodological analysis in social science. With the centrality of subjective experience, we begin to understand with both phenomenology and ethnomethodology that yet another variety of science is probably in the making. What we consider post-positivist social science is offering us not merely a simple reaction to positivism, it critiques positivism, it critiques scientific epistemology, and then it moves forward with an objective to offer yet another kind of scientific engagement with subjective experiences. However, we also notice that there is a line of difference between phenomenology and ethnomethodology. While phenomenology is a kind of science of subjective experience, according to Edmund Husserl down to Alfred Schuss, ethnomethodology tends to go to another extreme in exploring people's methods. Phenomenology also highlighted some kind of people's methods. However, it did not give in to the temptation of going to an experimental extreme, which ethnomethodology does. Ethnomethodology also subverted this fixed sociological idea with reference to Emile Durkheim. It subverted the idea of social fact as a finished entity. Instead, it emphasized on the ongoing character, on the fluidity of social fact. Social fact, fine, but social fact as finished product is not fine for in ethnomethodology. According to ethnomethodological interest in knowledge, in meanings, a social fact is an ongoing accomplishment toward which actors are continuously working. Actors involve variety of means, methods, techniques, recipe of action, and all those actions put together create a sense of methodology, which are not sociologists' methodology, these are people's methodology. So, this interesting turn to people takes ethnomethodology to another extreme, in the sense that it tries to bridge the gap between sociologists and the people being studied so strongly that one begins to get confused whether sociologists and non-sociologists, lay persons are same. This is interesting because in both the discursive realm for phenomenology as well as the discursive realm for ethnomethodology, in both the realms there is a new, a refreshingly different kind of intellectual politics being performed. By the way of offering methodology, they are also executing an agenda of intellectual politics in which the distinction between the studied, the seeker of knowledge, and the subject of knowledge, the object of study, the difference between the field worker and the field, that difference is bridged. That bridging is a little too aggressive as it appears in ethnomethodology. It is at the cost of what one can say critically, it is at the cost of intellectual integrity, it is also at the cost of the credibility of the accounts that would emerge eventually from ethnomethodological pursuit of knowledge. Probably this is the reason why ethnomethodology could not be as popular a methodology as has been phenomenology, despite the limitations that we have recognized with phenomenology too. With this kind of caveat, however, one has to realize that with phenomenology and ethnomethodology, we concretize what we usually call some kind of post-positivist social science. In more detail, we will be looking at some of the other signposts in post-positivist social science, so called, and with those other signposts put together with phenomenology and ethnomethodology, we would revisit the category of experience which has now switched its character from being deeply objective in scientific epistemology in positivist social science to being subjective in post-positivist social science and in scientific epistemology after the critical debates on modern science, on the nature of science and scope of science, which we did in previous lecture.